Hello, and welcome to Khyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play show set in the Eberron campaign world. It is Friday, so we've got a Khyber Shards Answers, and obviously I am solo today. We're going to be talking about villains, and particularly how sympathetic villains can and or should be. Obviously, we've had a variety of villains, and based on both the reaction of audience and players, I would say they've had a variety of degrees of sympatheticness with the player characters. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about my thoughts on making villains sympathetic, how we can, as game masters, make our villains sympathetic when we want to, and whether there are times when we shouldn't make our villains sympathetic. So first of all, these are just observations based on my experience with my various play groups. Different groups will be inclined to be sympathetic or not in different ways. This is also, I'm mostly going to assume that we're playing in a generally heroic, generally good aligned campaign. A lot of this, I think, applies even if you're not. You just kind of are reversing things because your adversaries aren't necessarily villains exactly if you're running an evil or even just a very, very morally gray campaign. But I think most of us as GMs are most often running campaigns that are generally good aligned and generally heroic. And so this, speaking to the what I see as the majority of games that in my experience. So if you're running one of those different ones, I'd be really interested to know what you think of making adversary characters who aren't necessarily villainous more sympathetic when your players are playing characters that are either morally questionable or if you're running an actual evil campaign. I've never run a just straight evil campaign. And I'd be very interested to hear what your experience was of making adversarial relationships interesting in those circumstances. So first of all, I think that a villain being sympathetic is not necessarily about whether they're right or not. I think that's a mistake that I have absolutely made as a game master, and I've seen other game masters make, is that I craft a villain or an adversary of some kind, and I intend them to be sympathetic, and so I give them a line of reasoning that I think should be perceived as right. And then when my players don't see it as right, I feel upset or annoyed or attacked by my players. I think that is a problem and a pitfall that a lot of game masters fall into because, especially for recurring NPCs and villains, we put a lot of thought into them usually, and we put a lot of thought into how they think. And so when their thinking is just dismissed by the players, that can be frustrating as an experience. And I can say that from a experienced perspective because I've absolutely been in arguments between NPCs and the player characters where I've started to feel attacked personally because I feel like I'm right. I am right. And the players don't seem to get that. So sympathetic does not mean right. It's about how the villain presents themselves and how you are wanting your audience, which for most game masters is just your players, how you're wanting that audience to react to them. I think we can kind of group the reactions that we're going for into 3 sets. So first of all, there are the villains, the main topic of our conversation, that we're trying to cause to evoke sympathy. That means that our players will not only understand what the villains are doing and what their goal is, but they might even find their methods somewhat appealing. I think the best example, just to use comic books, since that's been our touchstone for so much of this campaign, to use comic books, I think one of the best representations of this is probably a character like Magneto or the Punisher. Punisher varies from being a villain to being an anti-hero, Magneto kind of the same way. We understand what motivates both of these characters, both in what they're trying to do and in their background. We understand why they go about it in the way that they go about it. And oftentimes, their opponents, not necessarily the heroes who oppose them, but the other characters in the stories that oppose them, a lot of times their opponents prove them right. I think one of the best representations of the Punisher's ethos in media has been in the Daredevil TV show from Netflix a few years back. There's an argument, there's a scene where Matt Murdock and Frank Castle are arguing methods, and Frank Castle makes the point, "You're one bad day away from being me." And I think that is such a great representation that makes Castle such a sympathetic character, even though we all know that it's bad to take justice into your own hands, especially to the degree of just going around killing people in cold blood. Like, that's bad to do. We all know that, but we understand why Castle's been driven to that because we know his backstory. We know a lot about him. Same thing with Magneto. We understand that Xavier's goal of a world where humans and mutants coexist peacefully together because of the peaceful progress made by mutants is ideal. That's the best. But we also understand why Magneto feels like mutants shouldn't have to be the one to go the extra mile. And when we look at his backstory with being a Holocaust survivor, we understand where he's coming from, why he's unwilling to be patient in the way that Xavier, who comes from a much more privileged background, is willing to be. And there's all sorts of historical comparison points within the X-Men. It's such a rich story of analogies to actual historical justice movements and the tension between peaceful progress and justified rage. So a sympathetic villain is one the heroes are going to not only understand why they're doing what they're doing, but understand why they're doing it in the way that they're doing it. And it should be at least a little bit appealing to them. To make a villain sympathetic, you need to take the time to get the players familiar with where that villain is coming from, with what's motivated them. How did they get to the place where they are in their minds? Like what happened to them to bring them to this place? And I think, and this is tricky. It's easy for this to devolve into circular arguments that can be annoying. But I think a sympathetic villain wants the heroes to understand why they're doing it. And that means that a sympathetic villain is going to be more willing to debate the heroes, to try to win the heroes over to their side and get them to work together. A sympathetic villain, importantly, doesn't see themselves as a villain and sees the heroes as misguided and in need of correction. And so Magneto often engages in a debate with Xavier and wants to win him over. Like, Magneto's desire is for him and Xavier to once again be the close relationship that they once had. He just needs Xavier to see the truth, to see the reality of the situation. So a sympathetic villain is going to be more willing to argue. The sympathetic villain needs to have their background thoroughly understood by the players so that the players can see how the villain got there. And that means the sympathetic villain has to be recurring. I mean, you can do a sympathetic villain in a one shot, though usually the quickest way to do that is to make the villain a victim. River is a wonderful example of this. In the first adventure where the Strike Force met River, she was the problem. She was the danger. She was the thing they had to overcome. But it became clear to them that she was a victim of the situation. And so it changed from trying to kill her to trying to overcome her so that they could remove her from the bad situation. Um, so that's a very, very quick way, but that character is not really going to be a villain for very long. Um, for a good sympathetic villain that's still a villain, you need recurrence. You need them to interact with the players as often as possible. Obviously, I have tried to make Tommel a sympathetic villain, and based on reaction in the watch party and in comments, some of you would say I have succeeded, and some of you would say that I haven't. Um, the players, I think, started out with more sympathy than they have now. And that's because they've had the argument a few different times and their characters have gone through some things and are kind of sick of it. And that's understandable. That's a natural evolution of things. One of the best ways, if you can, and it's not always easy to do because you got to remember these things. One of the best ways you can make a sympathetic villain sympathetic is have them offer a dark mirror of the arguments for their actions and motives for their actions that the player characters have. In the recent episode where Tommel and the Strike Force go through a long argument over what Tommel's trying to do, I very deliberately had Tommel say things that the Strike Force have said. The unwillingness to just keep waiting. Like that's been a thing that Pog has said. That's a thing that Ari has expressed. The appeal to the need for power equaling safety, obviously is an appeal to Shade. And this was, to show that Tommel's thinking is not actually so far away. It's the you're one bad day away from being me. So, if you can do that, if you can have the sympathetic villain serve as kind of a foil, showing things about your player characters to the player characters, that could make a big difference and make the villain much more sympathetic. So I think a step down from sympathetic, it would be an understandable villain. This is a villain that the players can understand what they're trying to do, maybe even see like how their logic gets them to a place, but are appalled by what they're trying to do. Magneto, the Punisher, we get what they're trying to do. We think their method is wrong. That's what we object to. We object primarily to their method, not necessarily to their end goal. The understandable villain, I would say, is more like Thanos or the Red Skull. We get it. We see what they're trying to do. We see why they're trying to do it the way they're trying to do it. Their logic is clear to us, but it's appalling. It's horrifying. The logic is so far away from the thinking of heroic characters that a meaningful argument is unlikely. You look at Thanos in the MCU, they did a really good job of giving him enough screen time to explain why he was doing things, but there was really never any moment where we were like, he's going to convince Thor to join him. Like that was not going to happen. The understandable villain is not going to, probably shouldn't in a TTRPG engage in a long debate with your players, because neither one, they're too far apart on logic. They don't agree on terms. And so they're not likely to come to any kind of accord. But an understandable villain is very likely to monologue. This is very hard to pull off in a TTRPG because player characters will often disrupt a monologue by just launching an attack. I award my players inspiration in my D&D games when they wait and let my villain have their say. They don't have to, and characters would not always choose to, but if the players will hold on, let me say the thing that I've prepared, and then go into the fight, I'll often award experience or inspiration for that because it was courteous of them. So an understandable villain wants to monologue, wants to make their logic clear, but their logic is so far away from that of the heroes that they're not going to reach a compromise. There's no agree to disagree. We're going to have to fight. Thanos is a great example of that. Darth Vader is in a lot of ways sort of presented as a good example of that, although obviously there's a redemption arc in Star Wars there. But if you look at the things that Darth Vader says from Revenge of the Sith through Empire Strikes Back, where Anakin is compared to his opponents, Obi-Wan and Luke, is they're so far apart that there's no meaningful debate to be had. And then there's a third group of villains that I think maybe get underused in films, because we're so enamored of the sympathetic villain, and that's the incomprehensible villain. The villain's goals and motives are either obviously abhorrent, like the villain has actively decided, I'm going to murder people because chaos. Joker in The Dark Knight. He has some logic there, but it's an extremely twisted logic. He wants chaos and anarchy and as much death as possible. It's not like, I'm going to bring the corrupt system down and replace it with something good and wholesome. It's, I'm going to bring the corrupt system down and watch it burn. The villain's goals and motives are abhorrent or inconceivable. This is some kind of alien creature. In D&D, fiends and aberrations in Eberron the Daelkyr are great examples of this because they have a logic and a motive, but it's just nothing like the motives of human characters. And so it's just beyond understanding. Or the villain's motives are so primal that reason is irrelevant. The Joker I mentioned, Carnage from Spider-Man comics, the Xenomorphs from the Alien movies. Monstrous villains are this way. Things that are driven not by a logic, but merely by some sort of urge, some sort of primal desire, whether that be hunger or a deep-seated cruelty or anything else. The Emperor in Star Wars is this. The Emperor's got logic, but it's so obviously villainous. It's so obviously evil. And the way that the dark side of the Force is presented by him is so obviously horrifying that we're tempted to feel sympathy for Darth Vader. We're never tempted to feel sympathy for Sheev Palpatine. Like, we just aren't, at least not in the films. Don't come at me with the extended universe and legends. I'm not familiar enough with it. Maybe in those, Palpatine is given enough of a detailed backstory to give him some sympathy. But at least within the world of the films, he's just evil. He's evil because he wants power and he's willing to do anything for it. And that's bad. One thing to note about the idea of an incomprehensible villain, a villain whose logic is so out there or so non-existent that there's no way to deal with them other than to fight them. You can have, it's not to say all dangerous monsters are incomprehensible. You can have a dangerous monster that's sympathetic. Godzilla is often sympathetic. The dinosaurs in Jurassic Park are often sympathetic. You can take a monstrous creature, a dangerous creature, put it out of its environment, and that makes it very dangerous, but it's not necessarily its fault. If somebody goes out and captures an owlbear and then sets it loose in a crowded marketplace and it starts to attack people, it's not the owlbear's fault. The owlbear is not doing anything out of malice, but it does have to be stopped or it will kill a bunch of people, and these heroes have to stop it. And that might even mean killing it. So we can have a sympathetic monster whose logic is not there, and it obviously isn't going to have a debate or anything like that. But again, that kind of comes back around to the monster is really a victim in that circumstance more than a villain. When I talk about an incomprehensible villain, I mean a kind of monster that is a just unstoppable killing machine. Again, the Xenomorphs and aliens are such a perfect example of this. There's no option but force. You can't reason with it. You can't debate it. It's an uncaring, inhuman killing machine, and you have to stop it. And I think we should be using all of these, by the way, these are all types of villains that should be present in our campaign. Because if every villain, I mean, some player groups might really like this, but if every villain is one where we have to pause to think, but should I fight them? This gets tiresome. And we're playing a game. We're playing a make-believe game. Sometimes we should be able to understand that it's just fine to go fight the villain. Okay? Don't make all your villains sympathetic or even understandable. Occasionally, go on a monster hunt. We want all the types of villains. That brings us to one of the first questions, which is from Darren. Should all villains be sympathetic? I don't think so. I think sometimes you want a villain who is easy to fight, who is easy to say, nope, that guy's trying to just conquer the world and that's wrong. Or that thing is a brutish, evil killing machine and we have to stop it. Logic plays no role in it. So no, I don't think all villains should be sympathetic. Darren's second question is, what would you do if your players decided the villain was right? It would kind of depend on the nature of the villain. Hopefully, if that happens, it's because I've presented a villain very, very sympathetically. And if that's the case, I really think I could adapt. If the players in Khyber Shards were to decide that Tommel's right, and they want to join Tommel and work towards creating a world by force that aberrants can be safe in, it would significantly change the nature of the campaign. But I think I could adapt to that. Because I don't think it would be them going to a full evil campaign. If your heroes decide to side with Thanos, you need to know whether you're okay running an evil campaign and whether your players are okay playing an evil campaign. You probably need to have another session 0 sort of thing just to agree on terms and agree on limitations of what this is going to mean if we are joining the dark side. So I think I could adapt unless the players are joining a truly evil villain, in which case I need to have a conversation with my players and make sure this is the direction they want to go. Yeah. Now, a way to approach that is, if my players were to decide Tommel's right, let's join Kulsir, one thing I could do is, as they get the opportunity to know Kulsir more thoroughly, and I reveal more things about Kulsir, they might learn some things about Kulsir that are going to make them change their mind again. The MCU often gets accused of this as a bad thing, of presenting villains that seem kind of right, and then having the villain do something really, really evil that forces us to no longer be sympathetic towards them. I mean, that can be a repetitive pattern, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, villains are villains, and that's essentially the debate in a sympathetic villain is over methods. If the villain's entirely sympathetic and does nothing wrong, then there is no conflict. So even a sympathetic villain needs to do something to produce conflict if you intend them to be the villain of your story. And it may need to be something severe enough to motivate your player characters. So I hope I'd be able to adapt. It would be very, very interesting. I've never had that happen. But I would be very interested to see it happen. Colin asks, when do we meet the sympathetic villains? Emily asks, are there any villainous characters whom you've meant to come across as sympathetic, but the players and or viewers didn't pick up on this? It's definitely happened in games I've run. I'm not sure that I can think of an example in Khyber Shards. There are occasions where I feel like I may have put too much effort into making the villain sympathetic so that the villain is no longer seen as a villain at all. I don't know that there's necessarily an example in Khyber Shards. Probably the closest in Khyber Shards is Arandis. If you don't know lots about Arandis from the Eberron source books, and she is a sympathetic character in some ways, But the things that she's willing to do, at least per the source books, are evil. And if you focus too hard on her victimhood, then you are drifting away from her as a villain. And that's fine if you want to interpret her that way and not make her a villain. So there have been occasions where I think I've gone overboard on making a character sympathetic so that we lose sight of them as a villain. And that can be a fun story to discover they're not really a villain. But if you intend to use them in a villainous role in your campaign, then, they do still need to do something to produce conflict. So I would say that's been more often the problem that I've had as I've made characters overly sympathetic. But there have definitely been some times where I have tried to make a character sympathetic and my players are just completely dismissive of them in a way that can feel frustrating. Yeah. Laura says, please let us know when Tommel's redemption arc is going to start. Thank you. I know that's a joke. I know you're joking, but I want to take the moment to say it. The difficulty with a redemption arc is the person who's to be redeemed needs to realize they're wrong. And so far in Khyber Shards, Tommel doesn't see himself as wrong, and so has no motivation to seek redemption. So Tommel's redemption arc can't start unless he becomes convinced that something about his way of thinking is wrong. And at the moment, he isn't. Last question. Emily asks, Philip, semi-unrelated, but could you clarify something, please? According to my understanding, the non-drow elves who became the Iranian Terranidal Valinar, such as Cardain, Aaron, and Vidalia, were slaves of the Kulsir Dominion who successfully rebelled. Is this true within your campaign, or is this something that is no longer common knowledge, and thus something that will be clarified when the party go after Cardain's body? I have made one adjustment. Because there's something in the source material that has always struck me as a little bit of a conflict. We have this notion of there being elven ruins in Zendrik and a rich elven culture in Zendrik and all sorts of elven artifacts that you can find in Zendrik, but also the elves were enslaved by the Kulsir Dominion. So I have essentially said that while there were elves who were enslaved by the Kulsir Dominion, what was also true is that the elven cities of Zendrik, the elven cities that had come over from the Feywild and remained in Zendrik, were not so much enslaved as subjugated by the Kulsir Dominion, more in the sense of the Helots of Sparta or the Hebrews in the book of Exodus. They're not chattel slaves in that a giant owns various slaves. It's more that the whole city, the whole nation, is under tribute to the Kulsir Dominion and is forced to work for the Kulsir Dominion in the way that the Roman Empire put lots of different people groups under tribute. And sometimes that tribute would take the form of slaves. So did the Kulsir Dominion enslave elves? Yes, 100%. And even the drow elves were slaves upon whom experiments were worked. But were there also elves working willingly with the Kulsir Dominion as subjects and vassals of the Kulsir Dominion? Yes. Because in any kind of conquest situation like that, you're going to have some fighting in which some of the elves get conquered by the Kulsir Dominion. And then inevitably, some of the elvish cities are going to surrender, bend the knee instead, in the hope of more favorable treatment. And since I'm not presenting Kulsir as entirely insane, as I'm presenting Kulsir as having some logic to him, it makes sense to subjugate some of the cities and get the benefits of them. This also explains how you get elves working with the giants, as you would have groups of elves who are subjects of the giants and serve the giants well and thus get treated better by the Colseer Dominion. So it's a little of both in our history as we've presented it so far. Arandis makes reference to this when she's talking about the Forgotten Prince, that he was an elven prince who surrendered his city to the Colseer Dominion, and then when the rebellion started, he tried to keep his city out of it so that the giants wouldn't destroy him. And then when the giants came to destroy him anyway, he fled into the Feywild and abandoned his city. So you have a little of both. The way I see a rough history is that you have elven cities, city-states in Zendrik. They are conquered by the Colseer Dominion. Some are destroyed and their populations enslaved. Others are subjugated and put into a tributary vassal state. Then when the rebellion starts, it's a mix of rebellion by these subject cities and a slave uprising. And this motivates the giants to seek to completely destroy the elven cities. And when the slave uprising is at least somewhat successful, then you have the dragon invasion, and that forces things. The success of the slave uprising is questionable, because you don't end with elves free and prosperous in Zendrik, and not just because the dragons come and destroy things. The elves are successful enough that Aaron is able to lead the exodus to the island of Arenal, from which most of the modern elvish cultures derive themselves. And others, the drow particularly, who have a difficult history with the elves because many of the drow were people who served the giants willingly at first, either scattered into the jungle or fled underground. And then you have groups like the Sulatar drow who continue to be servants of the giants, even after, who completely bought in to the mythos of the Colseer Dominion and are still willing servants of the giants. I hope that clarified. If it didn't clarify, let me know in comments and I'll try again. But that's roughly kind of the way I see that history going for the purposes of this campaign. And generally that's how I interpret it in my Eberron, because that fleshes out the very, very sketch, the rough sketch that we get in the source books, that fleshes it out in a way that feels true to the way that empires grow and subjugate people. So that's why I made those changes, or those interpretations, I guess. Okay, and that is all of our questions. I hope this was interesting and useful. Let me know in comments how you have had success making villains sympathetic, and your interesting stories about that. Or if you have any other questions, put them in comments and I'll try to get to them either in the comments or next time I do a KSA. But in the meantime, you can find links to all of our social media in the description below. New Khyber Shards come out on Mondays and new Khyber Shards answers on Fridays. And until next time, thanks for rolling with us.